Olivia Hart had never planned on needing rescuing. And she certainly hadn't planned on needing it twice from the same man. Within her first 3 months in Maple Creek, the first time, she was skidding sideways on black ice on the county road into town, her car sliding toward a ditch on a curve she hadn't yet learned to anticipate, when a fire department pickup truck happened to be right behind her, its driver reacting fast enough to help her regain control before the slide became a crash. The second time, 4 months later, she would be standing in the middle of her own bakery's kitchen, smoke thick enough to blur the exits, and the same man would carry her out over his shoulder like it was the most natural thing in the world. His name was Ben Carter, captain of Maple Creek's volunteer fire department. And Olivia would later think that if someone had told her, on that first icy morning, that this quiet, competent stranger would become the person who taught her how to trust again, not just in emergencies, but in life, in love, in the possibility of building something new after everything she'd lost, she would have laughed and kept driving. She didn't know it yet, gripping her steering wheel on that first terrifying morning, that this town, this bakery, and this man were about to become the unlikely answer to a question she hadn't even realized she was still asking, whether a person could actually be saved twice and come out of it not just alive, but whole. Olivia had moved to Maple Creek 3 months after her engagement collapsed, not from betrayal exactly, but from the slower, more insidious erosion of a 5-year relationship with a man named Trevor who had, over time, made her smaller, quietly discouraging her baking ambitions, calling her dream of opening her own patisserie unrealistic, often enough that she'd eventually stopped mentioning it at all. When her Aunt Ruth passed away and left her a struggling small-town bakery in her will, Olivia took it as both an inheritance and an escape hatch, packing up her city apartment and driving 3 hours north with a car full of belongings and a fragile, barely formed hope that maybe, in a town that didn't know the smaller version of her Trevor had shaped, she could rebuild into someone who took up space again. She hadn't counted on the ice on the county road, or on Ben Carter's truck happening to be exactly where it needed to be, calm and steady over the radio as he talked her through regaining control of the skid, meeting her at the roadside afterward, with a thermos of coffee and a matter-of-fact kindness that asked nothing of her except that she let herself be helped, just this once, without argument. Ben had grown up in Maple Creek, taken over leadership of the volunteer fire department from his own father 5 years earlier, and built a life around a very particular philosophy, that showing up mattered more than grand gestures, that steadiness mattered more than heroics, a philosophy shaped in no small part by watching his mother slowly leave his father over the years for reasons that had less to do with any single dramatic failure and more to do with 1,000 small absences that added up to something that couldn't be repaired. His father, also once a volunteer firefighter, had been the kind of man who showed up heroically for every emergency call in town and somehow never managed the same consistency at home. Missed dinners that could have been attended, forgotten anniversaries, a general pattern of treating his family as the thing that waited patiently while he tended to everyone else's crises first. Ben had promised himself, watching that slow unraveling as a teenager, that he would build a life around actually being present for the people who mattered to him, even if it meant staying in a small town instead of chasing the bigger, more prestigious fire departments that had recruited him after his training. He dated occasionally over the years, careful, unremarkable relationships that never quite survived contact with the reality of small-town life and a demanding volunteer schedule, though Ben had always privately suspected the deeper issue was his own reluctance to fully invest in anything that might eventually leave the way his mother had left, however justified that leaving had ultimately been. He hadn't examined that reluctance too closely until Olivia arrived, until the particular ease of their growing friendship started to feel like something he genuinely didn't want to protect himself from anymore. He noticed Olivia the way the whole town noticed newcomers, quietly, with the particular attentiveness small towns pay to anyone trying to rebuild a beloved local institution like Ruth's Bakery. He started stopping in most mornings for coffee, not entirely by accident. Watching Olivia slowly find her footing behind the counter, watching the specific care she put into recipes that had clearly meant something to her aunt, watching too the way she sometimes flinched at customer feedback in a manner that suggested someone, somewhere, had trained her to expect criticism before kindness. You don't have to apologize every time someone asks a question about the menu, he told her one morning, after she'd apologized 3 times in a single 5-minute conversation about whether the scones contained nuts. You know your own bakery better than anyone in this town. You're allowed to just answer, without the apology attached. Sorry, Olivia said automatically, then caught herself laughing despite the flush of embarrassment. See, I did it again. It's a habit, Ben said, not unkindly. Habits can be unlearned, just takes practice. It became, over the following weeks, an easy rhythm between them. Ben's morning coffee stops turning into longer conversations, Olivia gradually revealing pieces of the relationship that had left her this careful and this apologetic. Ben sharing, in turn, the quieter parts of his own life. The weight of running a volunteer department in a town that couldn't always afford proper equipment. The complicated grief of watching his parents' marriage dissolve slowly rather than all at once. Something steady built between them, unhurried, the particular kind of closeness that develops when two people let each other see the unglamorous, ordinary parts of daily life rather than performing an idealized version of themselves. The bakery itself became, slowly, a genuine success. Olivia's confidence growing in small, visible increments as the town embraced her. Aunt's old recipes reimagined with Olivia's own careful touches. She started sleeping through the night, without the anxious replaying of old arguments with Trevor that had plagued her first weeks in town. She laughed more easily, apologized less reflexively, and found herself, without entirely planning it, looking forward to Ben's morning visits with an anticipation that had stopped being about the coffee weeks earlier. I used to think I wasn't allowed to want big things, she admitted to him one evening, the two of them sitting on the bakery's back steps after closing. The early autumn air cool and clear. Trevor used to say my dream of running my own place was cute, but unrealistic, like wanting it at all was a character flaw instead of just a goal. I spent 5 years slowly believing him. There was a complication that arrived unexpectedly in late September, when Trevor, Olivia's ex-fiancé, showed up at the bakery unannounced, having heard through a mutual friend about Ruth's inheritance and apparently deciding enough time had passed to attempt some version of reconciliation. Olivia hadn't expected the wave of old insecurity that hit her the moment she saw him standing at the counter. Hadn't expected how easily 5 years of careful diminishment could reassert itself in the space of a single conversation, even with a man she no longer wanted anything to do with. This place is actually pretty impressive, Trevor said, looking around with the particular condescension of someone offering a compliment that still managed to feel like an insult. I always figured you'd give up on this dream thing eventually. Glad to see it's working out, even if it's just a small town shop. It's not just anything, Olivia said, surprising herself with how steady her voice came out. It's mine, and it's doing well. Better than well, actually. I didn't mean it like that, Trevor said, though the flicker of surprise on his face suggested he genuinely hadn't expected pushback. I just came by because I've been thinking about us, actually, about whether we gave up too easily. Ben walked in halfway through the exchange, coffee order forgotten the moment he registered the tension in the room, positioning himself near the counter with the quiet, protective presence of a man who understood exactly what kind of conversation he'd interrupted. without needing it explained. He said nothing, didn't intervene, simply stood there with the steady calm that had become, in Olivia's mind, inseparable from who he was present, without needing to perform anything to prove it. "I appreciate you coming by," Olivia told Trevor, her voice gaining strength with every word. Ben's quiet presence behind her, somehow giving her permission to finally say what she should have said months earlier. "But I don't think we gave up too easily. I think I finally stopped shrinking myself to fit into a relationship that never actually had room for who I really was. I'm not interested in going back to that, Trevor. I'm genuinely happy here." Trevor left without much more said, and once the door closed behind him, Olivia let out a long breath, turning to find Ben watching her with something like quiet pride. "You didn't need me to say anything," he observed. "You handled that entirely on your own." "I don't think I could have 3 months ago," Olivia admitted. "I think some part of me needed to know someone steady was standing behind me before I trusted myself to actually say it." "For what it's worth," Ben said, and something in his voice was rawer than usual, "watching you run this place for 3 months has convinced me it was never unrealistic. It just needed a person willing to actually try, instead of someone convincing you not to." "You're very good at saying exactly the right thing," Olivia said, something warmer than gratitude in her voice. "I've had a lot of practice showing up for people," Ben said. "Comes with the job. Though I'll admit, showing up for you doesn't feel like the same kind of practice as everything else." The near kiss happened on a Sunday evening in early October, the two of them closing up the bakery together after a town festival had kept it busy well past normal hours, both of them exhausted and comfortable in a way that made the space between them feel smaller than usual. Ben reached over to brush flour from her cheek, an instinctive, unplanned gesture, and for a long moment neither of them moved, the entire kitchen narrowing down to the small distance between them. Then Ben's radio crackled, with a car accident on the highway requiring immediate response, and he was gone within minutes, leaving Olivia standing in the kitchen, with her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with the near miss of the emergency call. It was 2 weeks later, on an unremarkable Tuesday evening, that the second rescue happened. Olivia was in the bakery's kitchen alone, testing a new recipe long after closing, when an old wiring fault in the building's ancient electrical panels sparked against a stack of flour sacks stored too close to the outlet, and within minutes, smoke was pouring through the kitchen faster than Olivia's panicked mind could process. She made it partway to the front door before the smoke thickened enough to disorient her completely, stumbling into a display case, coughing, genuinely afraid for the first time in her life that she might not find her way out. Her phone, dropped somewhere in the chaos, buzzed uselessly on the floor with the text from Ben asking if she wanted to grab dinner after his shift. A small, ordinary message that would later feel almost unbearably poignant given what was happening in the minutes it went unanswered. A neighboring shop owner, closing up for the night, spotted the smoke through the bakery's front window and called it in immediately. And Ben's crew was there within 4 minutes, an eternity that felt, to Olivia, disoriented and coughing in the smoke-filled kitchen, like it stretched for longer. She didn't hear the fire truck arrive. She only became aware of Ben when his arms were already around her, lifting her with the same calm, practiced steadiness he'd shown on the icy road months earlier, carrying her out through smoke that had grown thick enough to blind her, into the cold, clear night air, where he set her down gently on the curb and knelt in front of her, checking her over with hands that were, she would notice later, shaking slightly despite his otherwise composed exterior. "I've got you," he said, the words a near repeat of what he'd told her on the icy road months earlier, though this time his voice carried a rawness that hadn't been there the first time. "I've got you, Olivia. You're safe." The bakery's kitchen suffered significant damage, though the rest of the building survived largely intact, and Olivia spent the following days in a complicated tangle of gratitude, exhaustion, and a fear that lingered longer than she expected, not just of fire, but of the fragility of everything she'd worked to rebuild in Maple Creek. Threatened so suddenly and so completely, she found herself avoiding the bakery for several days, unable to face the scorched kitchen, until Ben showed up at her small rented house one evening. Not in uniform this time, just in jeans and a flannel shirt, carrying takeout and an expression that suggested he understood exactly what she was avoiding and why. "You don't have to go back in until you're ready," he told her, settling onto her porch steps beside her. "But I also don't want you to disappear into avoiding it the way you disappeared into apologizing for yourself when I first met you. That bakery is the best thing that's happened to this town in years, and you rebuilding it, even after this, would be the bravest thing I've ever watched anyone do." "I keep thinking about how close it was," Olivia admitted, her voice unsteady. "If you hadn't gotten there when you did." "But I did," Ben said gently. "I got there both times, and I'm not going anywhere, Olivia, not from the department, and not from you. If you let me actually say what I've been meaning to say for weeks now instead of getting interrupted by radio calls." He paused, glancing down at his own hands, still faintly unsteady from the adrenaline of 2 weeks earlier. "I don't scare easily, Olivia. 10 years doing this job, I've learned to keep a level head in almost anything. But watching that smoke pour out of your bakery, not knowing for those 4 minutes whether you'd made it out on your own, that scared me more than anything has in a long time. I don't think I fully understood how much I needed you to be okay until I was genuinely afraid you might not be." "Say it," Olivia said, something hopeful cutting through the lingering fear in her voice. "I've spent my whole life building a philosophy around showing up for people, because I watched my father lose my mother to 1,000 small absences he never noticed adding up," Ben said. "And somewhere in the past 3 months, showing up for you stopped feeling like the job and started feeling like exactly where I wanted to be. Every single morning, radio calls and burnt kitchens included. I don't think it's a coincidence that I was there both times, Olivia. I think some part of me has been paying attention to you since that first morning on the ice, long before either of us called it anything. I spent 5 years with someone who made me feel like wanting big things was foolish," Olivia said, her voice steadying. "And in 3 months, you've shown up for every single one of my big things without once making me feel small for wanting them. That's not nothing, Ben. That's actually everything." He kissed her then gently, on the porch steps of the small house she'd been using as a temporary refuge, and it felt like the fear of the past week finally settling into something that looked unmistakably like hope instead. The bakery reopened 6 weeks later, rebuilt with help from half the town, Ben included, who'd spent several of his off-duty weekends helping install the new kitchen wiring himself, insisting on inspecting every outlet personally before he'd let Olivia so much as plug in a mixer. The reopening day drew a line out the door. Half the town's volunteer firefighters among the first customers, teasing Ben mercilessly about his by then well-known habit of stopping in for coffee that had clearly evolved into something considerably more significant. Ben's mother, Carol, who had moved 2 towns over after the divorce and rarely visited Maple Creek, drove in specifically for the reopening, having heard enough about Olivia from Ben's increasingly frequent phone calls to want to see for herself what had put the particular lightness back in her son's voice that she hadn't heard in years. She found Olivia behind the counter mid-rush, flower on her cheek and a genuine, unguarded smile on her face as she handled the crowd, and something in Carol's expression softened immediately, recognizing perhaps the specific quality of happiness she'd always hoped her son would eventually find. "He talks about you like you hung the moon," Carol told Olivia quietly, catching a rare lull in the rush. "I haven't heard him talk about anything like that since he was a teenager, full of plans before life got complicated. I just wanted to see for myself what put that back." "He did the same for me," Olivia admitted, More than once, actually. I'm not sure I would have found my way back to wanting big things again without him showing up. Literally and otherwise. That sounds like him, Carol said, something wistful and proud tangled together in her voice. His father never quite learned how to just show up, not the way it actually counts. I'm glad Ben figured out how to be different. A year later, Olivia's bakery had become one of Maple Creek's most beloved local institutions, expanded to include a small seating area where Ben still, without fail, stopped in most mornings before his shift. Though the coffee had long since stopped being the real reason for the visit. They'd moved in together that spring, into a house with an electrical panel Ben had personally inspected twice before agreeing to sign the lease. A small, private joke between them that never failed to make Olivia laugh. Carol visited often now, usually timing her trips around the bakery's weekend rush, insisting on helping behind the counter despite Olivia's protests. The two of them having built an easy, affectionate relationship that Ben watched with quiet, grateful amazement most Sunday mornings. And some mornings, watching him walk through the door in his uniform on his way to the station, Olivia would think about the woman who'd arrived in Maple Creek 3 months after a breakup, convinced she'd shrunk herself down to something smaller than she actually was, and feel nothing but gratitude for the 2 rescues that had, between them, taught her exactly how much space she was actually allowed to take up.